I'm not sure if you've seen the latest Guy Ritchie film, The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. It's loosely based upon a real commando raid during World War II, Operation Postmaster. In the film, already released in the USA and scheduled for UK release at the end of July 24, a team of British-led commandos seek to eliminate German ships that are supplying U-boats off the coast of West Africa. And during their mission, they have to rescue a comrade from Gestapo captivity and battle with Nazis on a remote African island. It's action-packed, fun, and typically Guy Ritchie. But viewer Alison Randall has contacted me to ask, how close is it to the real events? So, I've done some research, and Alison, this is the real story of Operation Postmaster in 1942, when British commandos entered a port in a neutral country and stole 3 enemy ships. The real events are like a James Bond movie, with incredible daring, plausible denial, an assortment of decorated war heroes, a director called M, and a certain Ian Flemming. The film's scriptwriters claim that it's loosely based upon Operation Postmaster, with a Rotten Tomato rating of 70%, when even Braveheart got 76%. Let's just say it's the word loosely that you have to bear in mind. Apart from some additional characters, and the fact that the commandos were fighting Nazis in West Africa when they were never there, I don't want to nitpick, but rather explore what really happened in World War II, because it's arguably even better than the film. On the 9th of August 1941, a Brixham trawler named the Maid of Honour left Neutral Harbour in England. Brixham trawlers were historically strong and robust, and the Maid of Honour needed to be because she was embarking on a top-secret 3,000-mile journey, Operation Postmaster. Operation Postmaster was organised and carried out by the Special Operations Executive, SOE. SOE were a clandestine force sanctioned by Winston Churchill, whose remit was to carry out espionage and sabotage behind enemy lines, and to use Churchill's words, set Europe ablaze. But it wasn't just Europe that they wanted to set ablaze. Brigadier Colin Gubbins was the Director of Operations and Training, SOE, and went by the code name M. And he cast his eyes thousands of miles away from Europe. In 1941, whilst the invasion of Britain had been staved off, the British were still very much on the back foot. It was only that summer that the Soviet Union was brought into the war, and it wasn't until December that the USA entered. German U-boats were roaming the Atlantic, where by the end of the year, 7 million tons of shipping had gone to the bottom of the ocean since the war had broken out. Britain's army in Egypt was desperately defending Tobruk against Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps. Meanwhile, Malta in the Mediterranean was effectively besieged from the sea and the air. And thanks to that Axis air and sea dominance in the Mediterranean, the only way the British could supply her army in Egypt was by sending ships all the way round the tip of Africa. When people think about the Battle of the Atlantic, they tend to focus on the routes between Britain and North America. But what most people forget, or don't even know, was that German U-boats were also operating in the South Atlantic, off the coast of Africa. Going all the way down to South Africa, they attacked unaccompanied cargo ships carrying supplies to Britain. But their very presence meant that they could also attack troop convoys heading from Britain via the Cape to the war in Egypt. It had long been suspected that German or Italian ships were acting as the eyes and ears for the U-boats, spotting prey and passing on the information. The British decided that any such vessels off the coast of West Africa were to be found and eliminated. Enter top secret Operation Postmaster. The Maid of Honour was heading to West Africa to seek out any supposedly civilian vessels which were actually acting as eyes and ears or supply vessels for the U-boats. The 5-man crew were all members of 6-2 Commando, a very irregular group of fighters. The sort of men who didn't think, act or fight like most soldiers, and many of them would end up in the Special Air Service later in the war. They were commanded by Major Gustavus Henry March Phillips, known as Gus, a veteran of the retreat to Dunkirk. On his return to Britain, he'd jumped at the opportunity to join the commandos. It was on the beaches at Dunkirk that March Phillips had met Captain Geoffrey Appleyard. He was recruited to 6-2 Commando and now he too was on the Maid of Honour. Appleyard, who celebrated his 25th birthday just before the raid, had joined the army shortly before the war. This Yorkshireman had gained a first-class degree from Cambridge University in engineering, and he represented both Cambridge and Great Britain at skiing. Even before this operation, he had been awarded a military cross in a previous commando raid. Also on the Maid of Honour was Captain Graham Hayes. In the film, his name was changed to Harry Hayes for some reason. They were fortunate to have, on such a long ocean journey, a member of the crew who actually knew about ships. 20-year-old Private Anders Lassen was serving in the Danish Merchant Navy when his homeland was invaded in 1940. Making his way to Britain, he enlisted in the commandos. They sailed through the Bay of Biscay and along the western coast of Africa, passing the Spanish Canary Islands. Whilst the film features a raid on a German base on the Canary Islands, in reality they didn't visit the islands, nor for that matter were there any German bases on what was neutral territory. And the Maid of Honour continued on her journey. Their ultimate destination was in the Gulf of Guinea near Nigeria and the Spanish-owned island of Fernando Po. Because SOE had identified 3 very suspicious vessels in the harbour there. Fernando Po, now called Bioko, is about 30 miles from the African mainland, and since the victory of General Franco in the Spanish Civil War, he'd installed a loyal fascist to govern the colony. Not only was he loyal to the Spanish fascists, but the governor was also sympathetic to both the fascist Italians and Nazi Germany. And there in the island's main harbour at Santa Isabel lay 3 ships from those nations. The largest was an Italian merchant vessel, the 7,800-ton Duchessa d'Aosta. She had aroused the interest of British intelligence because she seemed to have a very large radio mast for a ship of her size and character, and as Italy was on the Axis side, SOE believed that she might be signalling the whereabouts of Allied convoys to lurking German U-boats. Interestingly, whilst the Duchess d'Aosta's manifest listed a whole series of harmless commodities in her hold, the last page had been ripped out, and despite repeated requests from the Spanish authorities, the ship's captain refused to either supply the page or explain what goods had been listed on it. Did that missing page contain supplies for U-boats, or maybe even engineering equipment that could be used for repairs? The second boat in the harbour that raised their suspicions was a 200-ton German tug called the Likomba. With a German crew, she was perfectly able to assist any U-boat that was in trouble and potentially tow it to a safe haven for repairs. The third suspicious vessel was a diesel-powered barge, the Babundi, which was moored alongside the German tug Likomba. Although SOE were unable to ascertain if she was also German or neutral Spanish, she never moved from the harbour, and her proximity to the German vessel, along with the camaraderie between the 2 crews, set alarm bells ringing in London. All 3 vessels could be acting as eyes and ears, but equally they could also be helping to supply and repair U-boats in the vicinity too. It was decided that the 3 enemy vessels, based in a neutral but fascist-leaning port on a vital wartime shipping route, needed to be taken out. The problem for the British was they could hardly launch a naval or air attack on a neutral country without serious repercussions. The obvious solution would be for frogmen to enter the harbour and attach mines, but the harbour was so shallow that the vessels would only sink a few feet and could therefore be easily salvaged. Back in London in the summer of 1941, Major Gus March Phillips and Brigadier Gubbins, M, had been scratching their heads. How could they eliminate those ships without causing an international incident? March Phillips and M were joined by an officer from Naval Intelligence who was acting as the liaison point between SOE and the Admiralty. His name was Lieutenant Commander Ian Flemming. Ring any bells? The problem for the 3 men was that Fernando Po was a neutral port. Whatever plan they came up with, it could not have any British fingerprints on it. An overt British violation of Spanish neutrality could push Franco into joining the war on the side of Hitler and Mussolini. And if that happened, there was little the British could do to hold their colony at Gibraltar, and if that fell, the fate of the besieged island of Malta would also be sealed. And who knows what that would mean in North Africa. Moreover, if U-boats and German planes could use the Spanish Canary Islands, the U-boat war in the Atlantic could take a decidedly downward turn for Britain. They devised what was termed a cut-out operation. In other words, they would seize the vessels and sail them to a nearby British port. The challenge for SOE was to seize the ships without overtly being a British operation. It needed a level of deniability which the regular armed forces didn't do, and also a plausible reason as to why 3 Axis ships previously moored in a neutral port had suddenly ended up in British hands. The plan the 3 of them came up with could have come from one of Flemming's later James Bond novels. March Phillips would lead a small team into the harbour at night, board the 3 vessels, lock up the crews below decks, and use explosives to blow their anchor chains. To ensure as little opposition as possible, the ship's officers would be attending a party in the town. 2 British tugs would then pull the vessels out of the harbour in the dead of night and head out onto the open sea between the Spanish colony and British Nigeria. There, they would be intercepted by the Royal Navy, who would announce that the crews had mutinied, blown their own anchor chains whilst their officers were away from the ships, and were attempting to sail back to Germany and Italy respectively. Unfortunately for them, they had been captured by the Royal Navy, and the ships were now in British hands as prizes of war. In other words, the official British involvement would only come when they intercepted the ships, manned by their renegade crews, out in international waters. And just to ensure the story stuck, the crews would then be whisked away to a POW camp and kept in isolation. For the plan to work, it could not be linked back to the British. It was vital, M told March Phillips, that they were to avoid fighting, especially with neutral forces, and there were about 500 Spanish troops on the island. However, due to the diplomatic repercussions, even more important was that they avoid capture at all costs. The British Foreign Office were aghast. It was piracy, kidnapping and violation of neutrality all rolled into one. So was the General Officer commanding West Africa, General Sir George Giffard. When March Phillips asked if he could supply 17 men to provide extra muscle for the storming of the ships, Giffard said that he couldn't spare any, as he needed them for an unspecified operation of his own. He also expressed his concerns to London that such a venture was tantamount to piracy. As an interesting aside, Giffard had fought with some success against Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck during the East Africa campaign in the First World War. I'm thinking about telling the story of that campaign in the future, plus the real story behind that great film, The African Queen. What do you think? Type a comment below. In the end, the governor of Nigeria, who didn't seem to share the same scruples as Giffard, came to the rescue. He donated 17 men from his own colonial administration, ranging from local surveyors to police officers. He also made 2 government tugs available to pull the captured ships out of Santa Isabel Harbour. Meanwhile, the crew of the Maid of Honour had been joined by a further 6 men from 6-2 Commando. Finally, despite their misgivings, and harangued by Churchill, the Foreign Office gave approval for the operation in January 1942. 5 days later, on the 11th of January, the 2 tugs, carrying the 11 men of 6-2 Commando, plus their 17 locally recruited backups, slipped their moorings and headed out towards Fernando Po. During the preceding weeks, 2 SOE agents had travelled to the Spanish colony. Leonard Guise officially arrived carrying diplomatic mail from Nigeria to the British consulate on the island. And whilst there, he just happened to innocently row round the harbour, estimating the diameter of the anchor chains holding the 3 ships. He then travelled back to Nigeria, where he gave the measurements to March Phillips, who calculated the size of explosives needed to blow the ships free. Meanwhile, another SOE agent, Richard Lippett, had got himself a job with a British trading company with offices in Fernando Po. He befriended a German lady on the island, Frau Luhr, and convinced her to hold a party for some of the white residents in the port on the 14th of January. Naturally, all the officers from the 3 vessels would be invited. Mr. Lippett then generously paid for the event, and all the alcohol needed to make it go with a bang. He then turned his attention to bribing a particular local official. The authorities on the island had ordered that the lights of the town be turned off at midnight. Lippett bribed the engineer responsible to turn them off a little bit earlier, shortly after 11 p.m. And so it was that at 11 p.m. on the 14th of January 1942, as the lights turned off, we find Gus March Phillips and his little armada bobbing just outside the harbour. Ashore at the casino restaurant, the party was in full swing, and the officers of the Axis ships were having a very loud, enjoyable and drunken evening. The two tugs, named the Nuneaton and the Vulcan, manned by the commandos and their scratch team from the Nigerian Colonial Service, moved silently forward. The Vulcan headed through the dark towards the Duchessa d'Aosta. On board were March Phillips and Appleyard. Meanwhile, Hayes was leading a team of kayaks, similar to those you used in the Cockleshell Heroes raid, across the harbour from the other tug, the Nuneaton, towards the German boat and the Bubundi. As they reached the Bubundi, they were challenged by two African guards. But as the commandos with blackened faces leapt aboard armed with knives and koshes, the guards decided to jump overboard. Hayes and his team quickly secured both vessels. He was, however, still unsure whether they should take the Bubundi. After all, was she German or neutral Spanish? Luckily for them, when they entered the main cabin, they found a photo of the vessel flying a German swastika flag, and that settled the matter. Bubundi was coming too. At roughly the same time, the tug carrying March Phillips pulled alongside the 464-foot Duchessa d'Aosta. Anders Lassen was the first to leap aboard. They found the Italian crew asleep and locked them in their quarters, whilst placing explosive charges on the anchor chains. The party at the restaurant was in full swing when 3 flashes and accompanying explosive roars interrupted the proceedings. But as the town was in curfew darkness, the tipsy officers could not see the Nuneaton starting to tow the Bubundi and Lucomba out of the harbour, followed by the Vulcan bringing the Italian merchant ship. The explosions had, however, woken the town, and both panic and confusion reigned. Rumours spread that the explosions were from an air raid, and the port defences started to fire wildly into the night sky. No one had bothered to turn on the lights of the town, and so the ships glided out of the harbour in complete darkness, and without any shots being fired at them. When the lights were finally turned on, the officers at the restaurant looked in both horror and bewilderment at a totally empty harbour. The Spanish government were incandescent with rage. Their neutrality had been violated by, well, it must be the British. But there's the problem. They had absolutely no proof. The ships had been taken under the cover of darkness, no shots had been fired, no people had been captured or killed. Frau Löhr was brought in for questioning by the Spanish authorities, but professed her, genuine innocence. However, the chief investigator was more than a little interested in the British man who had paid for the event. Richard Lippett was taken in for questioning, but he stuck to his story that he was simply a businessman. Now, to add to the Spanish confusion, several sailors' hats belonging to the Free French Navy were fished out of the harbour. Now, technically the Free French was stateless, and it was the sort of bloody-minded action that their leader, General de Gaulle, might have sanctioned. Actually, it was another ruse thought up by Flemming. In Berlin, German radio claimed that British destroyers had entered the harbour, had dropped depth charges to blow the anchor chains, and killed all the crews. Their press accused the British of piracy. The British responded by stating it was nothing to do with them. But now that the Germans had alerted them to 3 Axis ships on the high seas off West Africa, they would indeed start searching for those enemy vessels. And lo and behold, on the 19th of January, HMS Violet just happened to find the Duchessa d'Aosta. On the same day that HMS Violet apprehended the Duchessa, Nuneaton chugged into a port in Nigeria, having rescued 2 ships out at sea. All 3 ships were claimed by the British as prizes of war. The prisoners were packed off to a prison camp in the back end of Nigeria before later being transferred to South Africa. By the time their story finally came out, Italy had been knocked out of the war. Back in Fernando Po, Richard Lippett was released, but told he couldn't leave the island as the authorities wanted to question him again. But before that happened, he got hold of an African canoe and paddled the 30 miles to the Nigerian mainland. Whilst a relatively small action within the whole Second World War, Operation Postmaster was crucial in proving the value of the SOE. Up until then, The regular armed forces had been highly suspicious of activities that broke rules, thought out of the box, and ignored the bureaucracy of the established chains of command. And yet, the operation had been an outstanding success. 10,000 tons of Axis shipping had been captured. Not a single life had been lost on either side, and 29 prisoners had been taken. It also sent a signal to the Germans and their Italian allies that their vessels were not safe, even if sheltering in neutral and friendly ports. And above all, despite all of their suspicions, the Spanish could not produce a shred of evidence connecting the departure of the 3 vessels to the British. Spain remained neutral for the rest of the war. Churchill, a bit of a buccaneer himself, was elated. Medals were showered on the successful team. Major Gus March Phillips was awarded the DSO, whilst Captain Hayes was awarded the Military Cross. Geoffrey Appleyard received a bar to the Military Cross that he had been awarded earlier in the war. Private Anders Larsson was given a commission in the field and was also awarded the Military Cross. And after his escape from Fernando Po, Richard Lippitt was appointed to the Order of the British Empire, as was Leonard Guise. In the film, a key member of the team is a female actress turned agent, Marjorie Stewart. Whilst there was no woman in the team, Marjorie Stewart was a real SOE agent. Co-writer Arash Amal claimed that she was included as a nod to the 3,000 female SOE agents who are rarely referred to, sort of raising the fact that they did serve, and many served in huge danger and with incredible courage. In real life, Agent Marjorie Stewart was to marry March Phillips on the 18th of April 1942, just 3 months after Operation Postmaster, a fact that is acknowledged in the film. 6-2 Commando would become the core of the small-scale raiding force, operated by SOE and reporting to the Combined Operations Headquarters. After Operation Postmaster, they were to carry out a series of raids on the French coast and the Channel Islands. It was in one of those raids, Operation Aquatint, on what would later become Omaha Beach, that March Phillips would be killed in action. He was 34 and had been married to Marjorie Stewart for just 5 months. On that same mission, Graham Hayes was one of only 4 men to survive. Evading capture, he was spirited away by the French resistance. Passing through Paris, he eventually reached the border with Spain, and there, a suspicious Spanish border guard handed him back to the Germans. Hayes was held in solitary confinement for 9 months before being executed on the 13th of July 1943. By incredible coincidence, on the very day of Hayes' execution, Geoffrey Appleyard, who was now serving with the Special Air Service, the SAS, was reported missing in action during the invasion of Sicily. Anders Larsson also joined the SAS, where he was promoted to the rank of Major. He was awarded 2 bars to his Military Cross, in other words, he was awarded the MC 3 times. He was killed in action in Italy in 1945 and was awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross, the only member of the SAS to be awarded a VC during World War II. Incidentally, he is one of only 2 Danes to receive Britain's highest military award for gallantry. The other, because I'm sure some of you will be asking the question, was Percy Hanson at Gallipoli during the First World War. Ian Flemming remained in naval intelligence for the rest of the war. A year after Operation Postmaster, he masterminded a plan for a covert campaign should the Germans ever invade Spain. He codenamed it Operation GoldenEye. In the 1950s, he would write the first of his James Bond novels. It's sometimes been suggested that March Phillips was one of the people whom he modelled 007 on. And of course, Bond's boss goes by the codename of M. Marjorie Stewart would return to acting in film and theatre through the rest of the 1940s and 50s, although never hitting the big time. She died in London in 1988, aged 76. The Duchessa d'Aosta would be reflagged and renamed the Empire Yukon. With a delicious sense of irony, she served as an Allied troopship for the rest of the war. And at the end of the war, she was reassigned to the Canadian government, who sold her to an Italian company. She was scrapped in Italy in 1952, sort of bringing her career full circle. And what of the Maid of Honour? Well, she was left in Nigeria, and she disappeared from history. And as for the film, The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, well, there are massive deviations from events, and characters that are completely fictitious. But then, it never pretends to be a documentary. It's meant to be fun, and maybe it should be viewed in that light. And finally, if the film hadn't been made, maybe I wouldn't have had the motivation to tell, and you wouldn't know, the real story of Gus March Phillips and the rest of the men involved in the incredible Operation Postmaster. Now, if you want to learn about another British commando raid in the Second World War that was made into a film, then watch my video about the Cockleshell heroes. There's a link appearing, well, about now. Please hit the like button, make a comment, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Finally, a big thanks to John, Eric and Alison for your support, and details on how to support the show are in the description. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.